My name is Muhammad Zishan Aslam and I am your host today. This session will be on the topic Lahore under threat, from new development projects to old, dilapidated neighborhoods. For this we have Rafay, an environmental lawyer, and Feisal Naqvi, who is an also lawyer.
Um, let me start off by saying that um,
स्टार्ट कर दिए
I don't specific, like sit on Huda all the time. I want to talk a little bit about Lahore and just mention two or three things. At partition, 75 years ago, the population of Lahore was under a million people. साढ़े आठ लाख थी. And it's grown exponentially in 75 years to just over 10 million. And
सलमान भाई
you have to understand how quick that is. बहुत जल्दी Lahore जो है, it has exploded. And the manner in which Lahore has grown has been sprawl outwards with private housing schemes. And the last study that I know that was conducted was in 2012. It was a transport study of Lahore. And it found, they did a sort of survey of the population of Lahore. And startlingly, they found that, what is it? 2/3 of the population of the city lives in 1/3 of its footprint. I'll repeat that, 66% of the people of Lahore live in 33% of its land. And the vast minority of people occupy the large sprawl. In 2013-14 में when I met the administrator DHA, and he told me उस वक्त, ये 14 की बात है, so it's about 8-10 years ago, that DHA had a population of about 600,000 people. But look at the size of it compared to, and so Lahore has grown inequitably by consuming peri-urban land. And it's very easy to convert that and to make a considerable amount of money to do so. And as the city has grown outwards, जिन लोगों के पास बाहर थोड़ी सी ज़मीन थी and a little bit of sense, they went into the property development business. And it's actually startling, I think 1 or 2% of the population of Lahore is registered as property developers, which is a very high figure. And what this means, what this translates is that like 40, 50 years ago, it's not like शहरों के अंदर municipal services have been sort of equitably or evenly distributed. I mean, जुगाड़ तो लगता था, मगर एक ज़माने में था, if you were a bureaucrat or a corrupt politician, आप अपने घर तक बिजली का connection, पानी का connection लगवा देते थे. That's no longer the case anymore with these private housing schemes many times developing away from the city's infrastructure. तो आप ज़मीन लेते हैं, वहाँ आप अपनी सड़क बचाकर फाइलें बेचना शुरू कर देते हैं, but you're not connected to the city in terms of road network or electricity or gas. But you already made an investment there. So what property developers have managed to do is they've leveraged their position once their schemes are in place to attract municipal services to them. And this is perfectly illustrated, for example, aap yahan se, on Mall Road, you can go to Lake City, right? Once you get on the canal, Lake City is one signal away, it's signal free. So municipal services like roads have been manipulated by private developers and other infrastructure as well, it's the water, the gas connections, to subsidize their developments. And this is a huge extraction of sort of power of the city to these elite interests. And it's not just the case of Lahore. You can go to DHA Islamabad, which is actually in Rawalpindi. You'll find a signal-free corridor taking you from Faizabad through Chaklala cantonment to DHA. And it's a perfect marriage between the Defence Housing Authority, which is a housing scheme, the Cantonment Board, Chaklala, and the Land Acquisition Collector, who all worked together to make sure that they had a signal-free road. And again, the protests and the development of the Malir Highway in Karachi is also an illustration, because Malir Highway will cater to Bahria Town, Karachi. So again, your private housing schemes are manipulating sort of local services to their advantage and to the disadvantage of the vast majority of Lahore, because again, 2/3 of the population lives in 1/3 of the footprint of the city. Ruda, if I may speak about Ruda specifically, is not just a project. Ruda ka kanun bana tha. Ruda, the elected representatives of Punjab found it necessary to develop the riverbanks, the Ravi riverbank, into a forward-thinking and sustainable city. ये कानून में लिखा हुआ है. So it's not just a project of the LDA. This is actually the expression of the will of the people. And so we went to court on Ruda. If I may, we went to court on Ruda a year and a half ago, essentially saying that this was not the best way to treat the Ravi, if you want to, because Ravi mein pani nahi hai. If you want to do a housing development on the banks of the river, you have to have water there and it has to be clean. Neither is the case of the Ravi presently. And building housing around it in an effort to raise revenue to make payments for the water and sanitation that's necessary, because that's essentially the key. कि आप इस housing development से पैसे बनाकर, you'll be able to have the money to do the waste treatment. That's the argument. But it's a considerable amount of money and you're treating the Ravi at Lahore. मसला इसमें ये है कि सियालकोट, गुजरावाला और फैसलाबाद का गंदा पानी भी रावी में आता है. So if you spend all of your money cleaning the Ravi at Lahore, you're not solving the problem because पानी दोबारा गंदा हो जाएगा. You have to treat the river as a holistic whole. So with these broad strokes, I will pass over to Feisal.
Thank you, Rafay. Rafay is both a friend and a colleague, but let me start first of all with a caveat. The caveat is that just like Rafay was involved in the litigation involving Ruda, I kept an eye on the litigation involving Ruda because I am counsel for the private developers who are now involved in one of the projects which is part of the Ruda area. So I'm just putting that out front, but please take my comments to the extent that you can as being independent of that prejudice. Let's start with Rafay's point about this is not the best use of resources. I'm not conceding that, but let's assume that that is correct. What I'm trying to say is, in simple terms, we should not let the best be the enemy of the good. Nobody is saying that this is necessarily the best. The best is always debatable. But his basic point about the explosion of population in Lahore is correct. Lahore is urbanizing. The one thing that this country does very well is an activity which results in the production of population or an increase. So Lahore is going to grow, it is going to urbanize, and there's not much you can do about it. You're going to have generic population growth and you're also going to have population growth because of people coming into cities. Given the way Lahore's geography is formed, because we're bounded on the one side by the Ravi, on the other side by the border, what has happened is that Lahore has not grown up or in terms of density, it has grown because in different directions. So एक तरफ तो अब आपके housing estates जो है वो वाघा border के करीब पहुंच गए हैं और दूसरी तरफ जो है अगर आप मुल्तान की तरफ जाएं तो आपको housing estates ही मिलते रहेंगे और वहाँ पे चलते जाएंगे. So you have this giant sprawl which is going, which is not good for anybody. Because it results, it's inefficient, it results in greater transportation requirements, and part of that has to do with cultural things, and I think Rafay can probably talk more about that. But एक हमारे culture में एक sort of romance है कि जी बस मेरा अपना एक 4 कनाल का घर हो जिस तरह बंगलो होता है अफसर का. And the most concrete example of that is the Islamabad master plan, which is, you know, much loved by Islamabad High Court judges, but in my view is an urban disaster because it's built around the car. It's not built around humans. So if we have to go forward, so point number one, don't let the best be the enemy of the good. Point number two, urbanization is happening. Point number three, what you need is some sort of dense urbanization which has to be, if possible, planned, has to be ecologically sensitive, it has to be sustainable, it has to be a number of different things. Point number four, and this is important, because there is so much of a demand for housing, either you do it, and by you I mean the government, or the private sector will do it, and the private sector will do it a lot worse. The private sector has money, the private sector has power. So या आप हुकूमत के ज़रिए कर लें जिस हद तक आप कर सकते हैं, या आप बैठे रहें and the private sector people will do it. So the fight over Ruda, notwithstanding good people like Rafay, actually in my view is driven not by sort of environmentalists versus evil or dumb government sector development, it is basically the government development versus private sector development which is funding all of this, because it would rather develop it itself. As per Ruda's own estimates, more than 40% of the land, by what I understand, there are private sector interests involved, either formally or informally, यानी कि या खरीद चुके हुए हैं या खरीदने की तैयारी कर चुके हुए हैं, and they will build their own housing societies. So again, my point is, you can either have planned development or you can have unplanned development. There is no, yes, ideally we would like it to be beautiful, we would like it to be green, we would like it to be sustainable, we would like it to be holistic. But that's not going to happen. आप इंतज़ार फिर करते रहे, मेरी भी उम्र गुजर गई यहाँ पे देखते हुए कि जी ये होगा या वो होगा या फलाना होगा, वो नहीं होगा. ये चीज़ आपको मिल रही है. So don't compare it to that would be an ideal. Compare it to what you are likely to get if it doesn't happen. And Rafay's point about it being an authority is important. This is not a private sector. So that means that you are able to hold it accountable. You can go to court and say, sir, ये rule है. ये उन्होंने नहीं किया, इन्होंने लोगों से नहीं पूछा, ये जो कॉम्पनसेशन दी है वो उनको सही नहीं दी. आई मीन रूडा वाले चले कम दे रहे हैं कॉम्पनसेशन, दैट्स अ डिफरेंट डिबेट, आई डिसएग्री ऑन दैट, बट चले यू मे थिंक दैट इट्स लेस, दिस इज अ मैकेनिज्म टू गो टू कोर्ट. आप कराची चले जाएं, आप जो लोग वो मलीर साइड पे जो बैठे हैं, जो बैरिया टाउन के जो मसले हैं, उनसे पूछे हाँ वो देयर लैंड टेकन अवे, वो किसके साथ जाके रोएंगे कि जी हमारी ज़मीन थी. द प्राइवेट सेक्टर development that is going to happen is going to be ruthless compared to what the government will do. It will not be sustainable, it will not be green. And I'm saying, please look at that alternative rather than comparing it to some hypothetical ideal, which unfortunately is not likely to happen. So on that basis, I'll pass it back to Rafay.
Thank you, Faisal. नहीं, फैसल ने कल्चर की जो बात की है ना, बड़ी दुरुस्त की है. जो ये 2 कनाल 4 कनाल का घर का कल्चर है ना, this is in fact, in my opinion, alien to us in a way of thinking. अगर आप लाहौर की तारीख देखें और लाहौर के अंदरून को देखें, it doesn't look like suburbia if you go to like the cantonment or DHA or the private housing schemes. आपको लाहौर की तारीख वहाँ नहीं नज़र आती. So what happened is Model Town was built in the 1920s. It was a lawyer called Khemchand and some investors, और उन्होंने कोट लखपत रिजर्व फॉरेस्ट की ज़मीन पे एक्विजिशन करके, जो इस वक्त मलिक रियाज कर रहे हैं, वो 100 साल पहले हुआ था, for again elite housing interests. And Model Town was the first housing society in Lahore which had gardens and flush toilets. It was a European style of home. And as opposed to the Lahore up until the 1920s, ये कृष्ण नगर का जो इलाका है, these are all bungalows, these are all relatively dense housing. The European style of housing adopted in Model Town it's alien to our environment because यहाँ चूँकि गर्मी पड़ती है ना, उस तरह के घर बनाने के लिए आपको फिर वो 16 इंच की दीवारें, 20 फुट की छतें, छज्जे, बरामदों की ज़रूरत है, as well as a garden that insulates your house. And what that means is a family of 4 lives in an acre plot. You can live like that, but आपको फिर एकड़ के plot चाहिए. और उसी तरह की vision हम लेकर हम अपनी development कर रहे हैं. We basically have this sort of European Western style of 2-story bungalows with a car porch and a small garden. That's our vision. ये culture है हमारा. We want this. मगर इससे जो हमारी डेंसिटी है लाहौर की, स्पेशली इन द पेरी अर्बन एरियाज जहाँ हाउसिंग सोसाइटीज़ हैं, इट्स वेरी लो. इट्स लेस देन 50 persons per hectare. अच्छा, 50 persons per hectare पे, जैसे फैसल कह रहे हैं ना, आबादी तो बढ़ी है, वी आर वेरी गुड एट पॉपुलेशन. आबादी हम मानते हैं बढ़ रही है और मानते हैं कि दुगनी होगी. But if you were to develop Lahore on a low density template like the housing schemes, आपको तकरीबन 2000 square kilometer मज़ीद ज़मीन की ज़रूरत पड़ेगी. And for context, इस वक्त लाहौर का जो रकबा है वो तकरीबन 1700 square kilometer है. So you'd need the same footprint of the existing Lahore to double the population if you go low density housing. मगर मैं अब high rises की बात नहीं कर रहा, मैं mid density की बात कर रहा हूँ. जैसे Paris for example, central Paris has a height restriction, you can't go more than 5 floors in Paris. और वहाँ फिर density तकरीबन 400 persons per hectare है, as compared to Tokyo जहाँ 1000 से ज़्यादा है per hectare. But अगर आप लाहौर की population को 200 to 250 persons per hectare density पे develop करें, instead of less than 50 as we're doing it now, you can double the population of Lahore in no more than 300 square kilometers, as opposed to 2000. जब आप 2000 square kilometer पे शहर बनाते हैं, उसकी land acquisition होगी. That's a cost that comes from the exchequer. वहाँ फिर आपको सड़कें बनानी पड़ेंगी public sector से, फिर आपको वहाँ बिजली के connection देने पड़ेंगे, and that all costs money. And that's money going from the public exchequer essentially subsidizing the urban elite जो कि घर खरीद सकते हैं. You don't need to develop the city this way. We don't, अगर हम अपना culture change करें ना, the way we want our cities to be, we don't have to live in this low density sprawl which is terrible for the environment. आप ज़मीन क्या कहते हैं, you acquire land, it becomes transport dependent on automobiles, फिर आपकी pollution के मसले हो जाते हैं, फिर आपके वो traffic के मसले हो जाते हैं, and all the other problems that we see in our cities. And if you built on better density, if you had more creative ideas on how to deal with density, you could, I mean, municipal services become more efficient to roll out. Because for example, public transport low density के अंदर चलता नहीं है, because there are not enough people to make the public transport financially feasible. But if you have higher densities, public transport starts making sense. And when public transport starts making sense, then people start walking around and you change the culture of your city. So one of the problems with Ruda and other housing sort of developments in Pakistan is that they're based on this idea of what we want our cities to look like, which is incredibly environmentally detrimental. There are better and more environmentally sustainable ways of doing the same thing.
I'm conceding Rafay's point that, yeah, high density is good. My question is, how do you get to high density? If you want to change culture, well, culture takes decades, if not longer, to change. People don't change overnight. Cultures change even more slowly. So if you want to get to high density, this is something that I looked at in a different context, where, you know, suddenly you allow, let's say, massive high-rises, 20 stories or 30 stories. Well, I think 14+1 was the limit in Karachi. If you allow 14+1, the point is that जो आपने originally जो low density चीज़ें बनाई हुई हैं. For example, when you planned Gulberg, तो 4 canal के plot थे, 2 canal के plot थे, 1 canal के plot थे. So you're, you know, sizing your sewerage, you're sizing your electricity, you're sizing your utilities and transportation based on a certain number of people. So if you contrast, let's say, a 2 canal or a 4 canal bungalow with a 15-story building, is going up by 200 times. All of those people are, you know, going to produce waste for 200 people. They're going to require transportation. What I'm trying to say is, if you want to get to high density, which is very nice, trying to retrofit it into existing low density areas is going to be very, very difficult. And the cultural point that I'm going to make, which is a generic point, is that governments are not good at isolated small things, because the transaction costs, if you want to put it in economic terms, the Coasian theory of transaction costs, you know, if I want each and every one of you to put in 5 paisas, maybe it's less money, but, you know, I have to run after each and every one of you. A lot of you will do it, a lot of you won't. What government does is, it does the one big project reasonably well. It doesn't do it great. It depends upon capacity, and governmental capacity has gone down in Pakistan. But वो एक बड़ी चीज़ जो है ना, वो government कर लेती है. So, for example, जब motorway बनी थी, तो everybody said कि जी आपको motorway बनाने की ज़रूरत नहीं. If you want to increase traffic or capacity to travel, आप इस तरह करें कि आप ये 20 सड़कें जो है ना, ये ठीक कर लें. वो 20 सड़कें हमारे से ठीक नहीं होंगी. होगा ये कि 20 में से शायद 10 ठीक हो जाएंगी. But motorway जो बड़ी चीज़ है, आप उसका contract दे देंगे, वो चीज़ बन जाएगी और वो काम करेगी. It's not ideal, but it will work. So from that perspective, coming back to Ruda is 100,000 acres, 102,000 in total. Part of it is going to be luxury. A large part of it is also not going to be luxury. It is going to be high density. It is going to have public transportation. Or to the extent it doesn't, its planning is a matter of public concern that you can all get involved in. If you don't like the fact that currently it also provides for luxury villas on an 18-hole golf course, because that, you know, ultimately, you need money, as we're finding out as a nation these days as well. Well, there was a meme going around, you know, of the army chief sitting with the emir of, or the leader of the UAE, and somebody had written on it, like, "Pehe kado." So, where you can get the money from? We're broke. You need the money. So, if people are willing to pay for it, you take their money. The point is, you take that money and you also build high-rise, sustainable, dense development with good public transportation, so people can get up from there and go all the way over to Lahore city or wherever it is that you want to connect. So the issue isn't the concept per se, it's the execution of the concept, and that's a different issue. Now, Rafay mentioned the wastewater plants. Ever since, the Indus Water Treaty, obviously Ravi has dried up. Ab jo usme aa raha hai, it's mostly pollution and effluents and wastewater. So there is a plan to take this money and to build whatever variously described as 7 or 9 wastewater pollution plants. Will that fix Lahore? Yes. Will that fix all of the pollution in the Ravi? No. You'll still have people upstream which will be throwing garbage into it and you'll have problems, but most of the water in the Ravi comes from, it'll be diverted. But it'll have a big benefit. And this is what I'm trying to say. If you focus on small culture-driven interventions, that's a long-term, low-impact, great strategy, but you can do that in addition to the high-impact, immediate intervention that you need. So one of your biggest issues right now is that Lahore's, I believe, water levels are falling. Your aquifers are not being recharged. The plan, so far as I understand it, is that Ruda will provide for barrages, will provide for consistent sort of water areas that will lead to a greater recharge of the aquifers. Is that ideal? I'll say that up front, no, it's not. Is that a good thing? Will you be better off tomorrow if there are, if there's a giant water feature next to Lahore? You bet you will. I mean, मैंने जो रावी देखा अपनी ज़िंदगी में, it's basically 90% of the time it's this slow, muddy sort of stream. It's not the Ravi of romance and literature. It's gone. That went in the Indus Waters Treaty, and it's a separate debate. Will you get something which is worth having? Yes. Will it be perfect? No. But it does have environmental benefits as well. But my point where I started off from was high density is good. To build high density, you need to build new. Building new is something that government is capable of doing, but it needs the money. You can get the money by selling big plots to a limited number of people. As long as you make sure, and this is where public accountability comes in, you also build low-income housing. But that you can only do if you have a public entity involved. If you leave that to the private sector, then you'll have, I don't know, Al Khalil Gardens number 13 or 14 or 15 or whatever. And I don't mean that as a dig on Al Khalil. I think they're developers, they're fine. वो अपना काम कर रहे हैं. उनका एक अपना role है. Let the government play its role. If it's not the perfect role, then you work on government and make it better, but don't stop it.
ये गुलबर्ग जो बना था ये 1950s में लाहौर इम्प्रूवमेंट ट्रस्ट का प्रोजेक्ट था.
If you go down main boulevard, जो main गुलबर्ग है वो जो 4-4 एकड़ के प्लॉट हैं वो exactly designed this way कि बड़े प्लॉट अमीर लोग खरीदेंगे ताकि फिरोजपुर साइड पे जो छोटे प्लॉट हैं वो subsidized housing लोगों को दी जा सकेगी. So there has been a model of this type of development before, and I completely agree with it. But coming specifically now to Ruda, रूडा जैसे मैंने कहा ये पंजाब असेंबली के कानून से बना है. द पंजाब असेंबली द इलेक्टेड रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स हैज सेड कि जी हमने नहर के किनारे एक शहर बनाना है और इसके लिए एक अथॉरिटी होगी और इस अथॉरिटी ने एक मास्टर प्लान बनाना है और इस मास्टर प्लान के तहत शहर जो है नया आबाद होगा रावी के किनारे. मगर रूडा डिडंट फॉलो इट्स ओन लॉ. जो मास्टर प्लान रूडा ने अडॉप्ट किया था वाज नॉट ऑफ इट्स ओन मेकिंग. ये जो मास्टर प्लान इन्होंने हाई कोर्ट के अंदर जमा किया था जिसकी बुनियाद पे इस वक्त डेवलपमेंट हो रही है वाज एक्चुअली प्रपोज्ड इन 2013. उस वक्त की PMLN हुकूमत ने एक फीजिबिलिटी कराई थी टू सी व्हाट वुड बी द चैलेंजेस टू बिल्डिंग ए रिवर डेवलपमेंट अलोंग द रावी. एंड एट दैट टाइम लाहौर डेवलपमेंट अथॉरिटी को जिम्मेदारी दी थी इस फीजिबिलिटी को बनाने की और लाहौर डेवलपमेंट अथॉरिटी ने एक इंटरनेशनल कंसल्टेंट है माइनहार्ट उनको काम दिया था ये फीजिबिलिटी तैयार करने का. एंड द आउटकम ऑफ दैट फीजिबिलिटी इज़ द डॉक्यूमेंटेशन दैट रूडा देन अडॉप्टेड. जो 2013 में माइनहार्ट ने फीजिबिलिटी बनाई थी उसी की बुनियाद पे रूडा का प्रोजेक्ट इस कानून के तहत चल रहा है. सो इट्स नॉट इट्स ओन मास्टर प्लान. इट इज़ अडॉप्टेड अ मास्टर प्लान दैट वुड अर्लियर गिवन टू द लाहौर डेवलपमेंट अथॉरिटी बाय माइनहार्ट. अब हाई कोर्ट के अंदर ये साफ वाजे हो गया था कि 2013 में जब माइनहार्ट ने ये फीजिबिलिटी लाहौर डेवलपमेंट अथॉरिटी को बनाकर दी थी लाहौर डेवलपमेंट अथॉरिटी रिफ्यूज्ड इट एंड दे ब्लैक लिस्टेड माइनहार्ट फॉर सब स्टैंडर्ड वर्क. और उनके खिलाफ फिर केसेस भी हुए. जो लोग LDA में माइनहार्ट के साथ काम कर रहे थे उन्होंने जेल काटी है नैब की. You're telling me that instead of following the law and having a master plan generated by the authority, you're taking a master plan, or you're taking a documentation, a feasibility, not a master plan, that was blacklisted 10 years ago. And now the interesting thing, again, these are not my words, ये High Court के फैसले के अंदर लिखा हुआ है. आज जो रूडा का chief executive है, was the Minehart country representative 10 years ago जिसको पैसे LDA ने नहीं दिए थे. This is a serious conflict of interest now, where specifically now I can start talking about where Ruda has made mistakes. This is the elected representatives of Punjab have said कि आप authority बनाएंगे एक modern शहर के लिए, और आप काम क्या कर रहे हैं? चोरी का. That's not how the law is supposed to work, and that's why Ruda is उस पत्री पे नहीं चला. If this was properly done, it would be a different ball game altogether. But here we have vested interests, a substandard master plan, which is not independently generated, जिसकी बुनियाद पे आप पैसे लाना चाह रहे हैं, which seems to me then, pardon me Faisal, this is a land grab, straight up. कि आप land acquisition करें, farmers की ज़मीन लें, and you sell it onwards to developers at a premium. That's not how land acquisition is supposed to work either.
If you want to see a land grab, look at the Federal Government Employee Housing Authority, which is much worse, because I did that case in the Supreme Court and lost. That is where one bureaucrat says your land is worth 20, acquires it for the state, allots it to himself, and then sells it for 80. Slightly different. This is not that case. So let's go back to what Rafay has said. Rafay has said, number one, it's not a proper master plan. Number two, there's a conflict of interest. And three, he's talked about chori. So the master plan isn't great. I don't have a dog in that fight. Make a better master plan. That's a legal issue. It's in court. It'll be decided that master plan theek hai ke bura hai. The point is the concept is okay. I'll make my point again. We're not disagreeing about the concept, and we're disagreeing about the execution of the concept. Whether you think that that master plan should have more low income or less income or housing or different issues, आपने जो उसमें कहना वो कह दें, वो एक अलग बहस है. बट ये तो फैसला हो गया ना कि आपको एक अथॉरिटी जो है उसको एक मास्टर प्लान बनाना विच शुड बी सस्टेनेबल. देन यू टॉकिंग अबाउट द इशू कि जी कितना सस्टेनेबल, कितना क्या, हाउ मच डू यू अकोमोडेट मनी, हाउ मच डू यू अकोमोडेट योर इकोलॉजिकल प्रिंसिपल्स. दैट्स अ डिफरेंट डिबेट. People can disagree about that. I'm not a master planning expert. I'm not even an environmental lawyer like Rafay. All I'm trying to say is that's a different level of debate. हमारी डिबेट सिर्फ ये कि मास्टर प्लान अच्छा है कि बुरा है या प्रोसेस के थ्रू आया है कि नहीं आया है. I don't know. That's before the court. The court will decide that. I'm not going to comment on that. In terms of conflict of interest, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not his lawyer, so I'll just say it generally. He used to work for Minehart. He no longer works for Minehart. He has past experience in it. He's now a government servant. He's not hiring Minehart anymore. So there is no conflict of interest so far as I can see. The third point being, there's a reference to chori. Bhai, chori kiski ho rahi hai? Kiski jeb mein paise ja rahe hain? That's a big accusation. And I don't think we should throw words like that around with great respect to Rafay. Bhai, kiski chori ho rahi hai? Aap zameen acquire kar rahe hain na kisi ki. The state acquires land the whole time. Are they getting a reasonable price? You can say it's not a reasonable price. Okay? What's the market price? What is the total value that's being offered? One of the good things which has happened, because the public pressure from people like Rafay, is that the total package being offered to people now is a lot better, because in addition to cash, which is limited, they're also getting land for land. And I believe that the file that they're getting in return is in a project which is coming up. I think Ruda is building something at a place called Chaubahar, which is away from the river banks a bit. And that file is tradable. As per my information, तो आपको जो land value इस वक्त जो है वो को 20 लाख रुपए एकड़ है generally, and जो इनको cash value जो मिल रही है in terms of cash plus the value of the file is something like 80-90 lakhs. And the point is besides that, then we're talking about money. Okay, is Ruda in the ballpark? Yes or no? But there is no chori going on. किसी के private जेब में नहीं जा रहा. अगर आप कहें कि जी गवर्नमेंट की जेब से, गवर्नमेंट की पावर लेके मैं अपनी जेब में डाल रहा हूँ, या ये इमरान अमीन जो कि चीफ एग्जीक्यूटिव रूडा है उसकी ज़ाती जेब में डाल रहे, तो आप कह सकते हैं कि ये चोरी है. दिस इज़ अ गवर्नमेंट प्रोजेक्ट. Unless you can show individual personal benefit of somebody who is active within it, I think that allegation would be unsubstantiated.
Assalamu alaikum ji. My name is Fasiuddin. I'm a development specialist and have been engaged with the government entities since 2009. आप दोनों से भी मेरा काम के सिलसिले में ताल्लुक़ रहा है. जो कॉन्सेप्चुअली एक बात बड़ी अच्छी आप दोनों साहिबान ने की है कि गवर्नमेंट जब कल्चर चेंज करने पे आती है या करना चाहती है तो इट टेक्स टाइम. जो हाई राइज एलिवेशन की तरफ बात हुई और पॉपुलेशन डेंसिटी की तरफ बात हुई, तो गवर्नमेंट को ये नहीं चाहिए था कि कल्चर चेंज करने की तरफ उसको लेके चलती, ना कि एक उस तरह के ऑल्टरनेट की तरफ चली जाती कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर के कंपैरेटिवली जा रही है कि आप उसको उनके मुकाबले पे या पैरेलल पे आप प्रॉपर्टी डेवलपमेंट का काम करना शुरू कर रहे हैं. सेकेंडली जो कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ रूडा यहाँ पे राफे साहब ने जो बात की 2013 के हवाले से, आई एम ग्लैड समवन टुक इट अप बिकॉज ये एग्जैक्टली वहीं से स्टार्ट हुआ था जो माइन हार्ट की आप बात कर रहे हैं. उसमें भी जो वेस्ट ट्रीटमेंट का प्रोजेक्ट था ना, वो प्रायर था कि इसे प्रॉपर्टी डेवलप की जाए. तो ये दो पॉइंट्स हैं कि कल्चर एस्पेक्ट पे चेंज करते हुए गवर्नमेंट को क्या हाई राइज डेंसिटी और पॉपुलेशन डेंसिटी की तरफ जाते हुए वो काम करना चाहिए था, या ये प्रॉपर्टी डेवलपमेंट की तरफ जाते. और सेकेंडली कि जो वेस्ट ट्रीटमेंट का काम था वो प्रॉपर्टी डेवलपमेंट से पहले होना चाहिए था. इस पे मैं आप दोनों का कमेंट जो है ना चाहूँगा. थैंक यू.
फसीउद्दीन साहब, number one, let me take them in reverse order and then Rafi can give it. Waste treatment plant should happen no matter what, in which order. जिस तरह मर्जी जैसे हो वेस्ट ट्रीटमेंट प्लांट बना दें. बिकॉज अगर हम इंतज़ार करते रहेंगे कि पहले वो जैसे भी है उसको बना दें, इट्स अ गुड थिंग. इट विल help the environment. If this is where the funding is coming from, fine, I'll take it from that source. From any which source. If your point is that the demand for wastewater treatment existed prior to Ruda, you're correct. But the question you need to ask yourself is, why hasn't the state done it? The state likes to do, and the first time I heard this phrase was what was called lumpy development. The state likes to do development which is visible. एक आप ऐसी चीज़ बनाते हैं जो कि द आइडियल डेवलपमेंट इन सम वेज इज जंगला बस बन गई, पीपल यूज इट, इट्स विजिबल एवरी डे, यू यूज इट और यू ड्राइव पास्ट इट और यू सी इट, ये देखें ये मैंने बनाई है. वेस्ट वाटर ट्रीटमेंट इज समथिंग विच इज़ बाय एंड लार्ज इनविजिबल, लाइक फिक्सिंग कि भाई लाहौर में जब बारिश होती है, व्हाई डोंट पीपल फिक्स इट? इट्स नॉट अ वेस्ट ऑफ मनी बट इट्स इनविजिबल मनी, राइट? बट इट्स नेसेसरी. So it gets put to the end of the queue. So for whatever reason, for however you get it, if you can get wastewater treatment plants, it's something that we all need. In terms of culture, yes, you should change culture, but there is only so much that you can do. आप किस तरह change करते? Culture changes through incentives. When property becomes too expensive, then people start looking at alternatives. अब पिछले 5 साल में लाहौर में 5 से 10 साल में I would say कि apartment living has suddenly emerged. Because you have this development of high-rise, not just high-rise, but high-quality apartment buildings, where people are comfortable thinking कि यार हम यहाँ पे रह सकते हैं, it's worth going into, and it's now coming up as a concept. But culture is this giant amorphous thing. जिन लोगों के दिमाग में पिछले पता नहीं सदियों से है कि जी घर होगा, बंगला होगा, साथ बाग होगा, you can't get rid of it that easily. You should do it as well. But the point is, we live in the here and now. What can you do now? What is it that is available? Take that which is available. Don't let the best be the enemy of the good.
Can't argue with that. मैं waste treatment के बारे में just a couple of challenging issues because लाहौर में मेरा ख्याल 2,500 cubic variable 2 to 2,500 cubics of water, of dirty water is discharged into the Ravi because हमारे जो 12-14 बड़े sewers हैं वो रावी में पानी फेंकते हैं. They're not treated, it's not treated at all. तो 12-14 मेन ड्रेन्स हैं जिससे पानी लाहौर का रावी के अंदर चला जाता है. तो इसको साफ़ करने के लिए बिकॉज ये जो ड्रेन्स होती हैं दे डोंट जस्ट कैरी डोमेस्टिक एफ्लुएंट जो कि घर का पानी होता है, दे ऑल्सो कैरी कमर्शियल एंड इंडस्ट्रियल एफ्लुएंट. तो ये एफ्लुएंट को साफ़ करने की मुख्तलिफ टेक्नोलॉजीज़ होती हैं. जो घर का वेस्ट होता है ना, इट्स एक्चुअली रिलेटिवली चीप एंड सिंपल टू ट्रीट, बट industrial wastes, with heavy chemicals and things, heavy metals and things like that, वो थोड़ा मुश्किल हो जाता है. And you need to have these specialized plants then called combined effluent treatment plants that can treat any type of water that it's receiving. It's like the nuclear option, as it were, for waste treatment. Otherwise, you can very specifically tailor waste treatment to the type of industry and the type of effluent it is. Magar chunke hamari drains mein mixed effluent aata hai, we have to use these things called combined effluent treatment plants. Ye महंगी चीज़ें हैं. This is like $1 billion for a plant, and it takes a considerable amount of electricity to operate as well. So let's be realistic. Wanting waste treatment is one thing, and getting it is another. Because आपको पैसों की ज़रूरत है, as Faisal said, this is invisible money, it's not visible, so these are not high priority projects. दूसरा, इन मशीनों को चलाने के लिए you need specific skill sets. ये combined effluent treatment plant है, you need to have engineers running it. हमारे, and I bless them, water and sanitation people work very hard, but they're essentially plumbers. वो आपके घर तक पानी लाते हैं और फिर पानी लेते हैं. They don't have the expertise to be able to run these machines. So as Lahoris, you should know कि आपका जो गंद है, वो तो, it's your waste that's going into the Ravi, किसी और का नहीं है. And none of us pay any tax or have any sort of interest or whatsoever in treating the water of the Ravi at all, because there's no treatment whatsoever. और ना कोई मांगता है, ना कोई मिलती है. Now, if you were to set up a combined effluent treatment plant, अगर स्टेट के पास $1 billion हैं और वो लाहौर में एक दो इस तरह के लगा देते हैं, उसका भी सोचें एक सेकंड के लिए, because the state is subsidizing the construction of this very expensive and difficult to run effluent treatment plant, मगर upstream उस नाले के अंदर जो लोग गंदा पानी फेंक रहे हैं, वो अपनी आदतें नहीं बदल रहे. So essentially you're subsidizing the continued illegal dumping of waste by industry by setting up these combined effluent treatment plants. So ये मसले हो जाते हैं जब environmental regulation की जब आप बात करते हैं, it's a question for the state, do we invest so much money in something when it's not going to change behavior upstream, and we'll continue to see dirt being thrown into and chemicals being thrown into industry. इसका alternative है the environmental law, the principle of environmental law is the polluter must pay. So in many ways हमारे कानून का जो focus है, it's not on, for example, combined effluent treatment plants. हमारा कानून जो है वो focus करते हैं polluter पे, कि वो अपने दीवार से या अपनी हदूद से कोई गंद ना निकाले. So that's a different way of regulating the environment, and these are just challenges for any state, any municipality in Pakistan or anywhere in the world when it's dealing with these things. ये आसान काम नहीं है, and it's made more complicated by these issues as well.
I'm basically from UMT. मेरा क्वेश्चन ये, क्या पे बात हुई थी कि हमने कल्चर हाउसिंग स्टाइल का अडॉप्ट कर लिया यूरोपियन एंड वेस्टर्न, तो वो कल्चर जनरेट क्या डेवलपर्स और आर्किटेक्ट्स की तरफ से हुआ था या सिविलियंस की तरफ से हुआ था? आई हैव दिस क्वेश्चन.
Because मैंने बात की थी कल्चर की, ये मेरी theory है, माफ कर दे, मैं वकील हूँ, I can't make grand statements about Lahore, but let me. और वो यही है कि Model Town was an aspiration. It was moving from places like Krishnagar and the walled city, being seen to be affluent, being seen to live in a Western style, having these things. ये हमारी सोच थी, हम इस तरह रहना चाहते थे. And we've followed that model almost consistently since Model Town, because all of the new housing developments you see in Lahore post-partition, they don't bear any resemblance to the sort of architecture or design that you find in the walled city or any of the old cities in Pakistan. So this is very much a sort of cultural shift that we've experienced. I like Model Town, please don't take me wrong.
So let me, in continuation of that, and in reference to Christian Nagar as well, when my parents moved to Lahore in 1969, and I was 1 year old then, and the entire extended clan used to live in Christian Nagar, and I've seen Christian Nagar. I wouldn't want to live there. With great respect to people who do live there, and at that time we then shifted to Model Town and grew up, and there was Model Town at that time was the other side of the universe. जब हमारा जो घर जो था उसके सामने खेत थे, literally. So I was on the outer ring road, and you could just go out, and there was just fields as far as you could see. Now, obviously, it's different. So I think the point being that people, you're talking about now taking your Pakistani society, you're exposing it to the world. So people see what's out there. They will see what's out there in the West. They'll see what's out there in the East. You can expose them to, for example, the type of high density living you have normally in Singapore, which is reckoned to be a public housing success. But people want those things. Now, who's going to build high quality, high density public housing in, Christian Nagar? And when is that going to happen? And in the meantime, who's going to wait for it? So culture is a great thing, but and there is an interplay. I mean, it's like, why do people like to smoke cigarettes? Is that because of the Marlboro Man? Is because tobacco is addictive? It's sort of, there's sort of circularity to that. But point being, if you want to change culture, you have to also provide a product which people can access and then sell it as well. So making that product depends upon what's available and how much money you have and what your fiscal opportunities are. It's not that easy to simply say कि भाई ये हमारा culture नहीं है. वो जो पुराना culture जो था, with again, to go into those high density old areas, like my grandparents lived in Jhang. All the houses were connected. You could skip over from one roof to the other, etc., and things like that. But it was built in a very old style. Like when I was a kid, you would still see walls जिसके ऊपर वो, you know, गोबर की पट्टियाँ लगी होती थी, and things like that. You didn't have, you know, you had open sewers. Now, that isn't a great way to live either, but you can enclose the sewers, you can put in piping, you can put in plumbing, but again, that becomes more difficult. But to get people to accept that over time, the people want these good things. These are necessary because you get good health benefits from all of these things. So culture and development go hand in hand. You can, you know,
just say कि culture अपनी जगह, this city has far more golf courses than our culture should allow for. Right? एक ज़माने में
Rafay is an apostate on golf issues, having been a champion golfer in his youth.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, I have another question. कि यहाँ पे बात हुई थी कि housing schemes बनाते हुए कुछ घर हमने yes मेरे बैच में I know. जस्ट ये क्वेश्चन था कि हमने हाउसिंग स्कीम्स ऐसे डिवाइड कर दी हैं कि वो क्लास सिस्टम जनरेट कर रही हैं. तो व्हाट योर थॉट्स ऑन दिस कि अगर हमने अमीरों के लिए सेपरेट घर बना दिया फॉर द लीड क्लास कि वो मनी जनरेट कर रहा है, वट एवर द पर्पज़ है, बट वो क्लास सिस्टम, व्हाट योर थॉट्स कि उसको कैसे कम किया जा सके कि क्लास सिस्टम हमने हाउसिंग स्कीम्स में भी जनरेट कर दिया.
एक्सक्यूज मी सर, प्लीज़ टेक ये दोनों क्वेश्चन साथ से लीजिए क्योंकि इंटर रिलेटेड है. माय नेम इज़ मुजम्मिल तारिक एंड आई एम फ्रॉम द यूएमटी यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ मैनेजमेंट टेक्नोलॉजी एंड बीइंग ए सोशियोलॉजिस्ट मैं फोकस करता हूँ सर कल्चर पे. आपने कहा कि कल्चर चेंज करना चाह रहे हैं या गवर्नमेंट करती है. सर देयर आर ऑलवेज टू टाइप्स ऑफ कल्चर, वन इज़ मटीरियल कल्चर एंड अनदर इज़ नॉन मटीरियल कल्चर. यू आर पर्टिकुलरली फोकसिंग ऑन मटीरियल कल्चर एंड एज ए बीइंग ए नेटिव ऑफ शाहदरा जो बिल्कुल उसके साथ है, तो आपको नहीं लगता सर डेवलपमेंट के बाद देयर विल बी टू टाइप्स ऑफ कम्युनिटी, द अपर क्लास, द लोअर क्लास. और आप मटेरियल कल्चर को तो चेंज कर रहे हैं लेकिन नॉन मटेरियल कल्चर का क्या? वहाँ पे जो सोसाइटीज़ में क्लैश आएगा, आप डीएचए देख लें, उसकी वॉल्स के साथ स्लम्स हैं. आप मॉडल टाउन से हैं, उसके साथ स्लम्स हैं. जोहर टाउन के साथ स्लम्स हैं. तो व्हाट अबाउट द नॉन मटेरियल कल्चर? क्योंकि आई थिंक सो, इन माय ओपिनियन, द नॉन मटेरियल कल्चर इज़ मोर इम्पोर्टेंट दैन मटेरियल कल्चर. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल आप मेंटालिटी चेंज करते हैं, उसके बाद आप मटेरियल कल्चर की तरफ जाते हैं. सो आप दोनों के कमेंट चाहिए इस पर. थैंक यू.
मेंटालिटी चेंज करने पे तो वही है ना कि कौन जीता है तेरी जुल्फ के साथ होने तक, which is fine, but I mean we'll all be dead by then. The other point is, in terms of creating classes through development, yes, it is a problem. And that is something that the state needs to address. The state should try and provide high quality, housing to low income families. And if you look at the development in Singapore in particular, Singapore is a very, very rich country with a lot of very, very rich people, but the majority of the population lives in these HDB flats, and people are used to that. So you will have classes, you can't get around that, but the point is the facilities being provided to the lowest classes should be of a reasonable standard. It should not be कि एक बंदा मर रहा है और एक बंदा प्राइवेट जेट पे घूम रहा है. प्राइवेट जेट पे ज़रूर घूमे, बट जो बंदा जो निचले तबके का है उसको कम से कम बेसिक फैसिलिटीज़ दें, हेल्थ दें, एजुकेशन दें, हाउसिंग दें. पब्लिक, the state should help to provide that, but it will provide that again most likely through fresh development, which will require high density building of a certain quality. It should be recognized as a priority. No dispute there.
Can't argue with that again. मैं एक चीज़ कहना चाहता हूँ कि शहर के अंदर जो भी आप चीज़ देखते हैं, was put there by human hands. माल रोड पे जो दरख्त लगे हुए हैं वो अंग्रेज़ों ने लगाए थे. सड़क की चौड़ाई, the color of the sidewalk, the buildings, everything is made by man in any city. Cities are unique this way, and as a sociologist, I hope you appreciate this. They're one of the great inventions of human civilization, containing both the greatest of mankind's achievements and the worst of mankind as well, in the social inequity that you were talking about. But everything in a city is made by man. And so cities are unique that way, that man shapes his environment in a city and then ironically gets shaped by that environment in return. This is a symbiotic relationship that you will always have with cities. And it goes to point, whatever you see in a city is a reflection of what the city wants it to be. So if you have inequity in your city, at some level it's because the people of that city find the inequity acceptable. And we do. We have no problem in our cars with poor, starving children next to us begging. It doesn't seem to upset us. If someone were to come in here, it would be quite disturbing, but we have, again, we accept it. So many of the flaws in our cities are flaws of our own society in many ways.
Rafay may know more about this, but underground mass transit is way more expensive than above ground mass transit. So the question is it a good idea? Given the limited amount of tax resources available, it's only a question of whether it's a cost-efficient use of resources. In 2006, 2007, the Punjab government, I remember, was looking at this. There was this French company called Sistra or something like that, and they did a feasibility study, and that was then replaced, and you had the metro bus system, which, okay, again, is not great, but as the phrase goes, chalti ka naam gaadi. So it's not as good as, let's say, the London Underground, and maybe you'll do that, but you need to have more money, a better tax base, and if you have the money, do it. But if you don't have the money, at least build some other form of public transportation. In that sense, the Orange Line and above ground is much better, because at least it gets built.
Actually, ये जो सिस्टर की आप बात कर रहे हैं, ये 2006 का जो प्रोजेक्ट था लाहौर की ट्रांसपोर्ट का, it envisioned the Firozpur Road as a backbone, जिस पे अब जंगला बस है, and then an Orange Line and a bunch of other transports that then cut across the city, and Orange Line was one of them. अब उसके इजाफे में अब जंगला बस तो बन गई है फिरोजपुर रोड पे, Orange Line भी बन गई है. Now they're planning a third line which is also going to connect all the way to the airport. So शायद उसके बारे में आप बात करें. These are big visions that the government of Punjab has had for quite a while, and there are incredible costs and relocations that are involved in this. I just hope that the lessons of the Orange Line will be learnt, and we don't make the same mistakes that we did in the Orange Line. And it's not the land acquisitions that I'm particularly concerned with. There were people who died in the construction of the Orange Line, literally. वो नहीं होना चाहिए. People should not die because infrastructure is being built. We need to also then make sure that the acquisitions are done in a way that people are given time and adequate compensation, and then heritage is preserved where it can be. But ये चीज़ें आप करना बहुत मुश्किल होता है इस मुल्क के अंदर, and I do appreciate when these things do actually get done.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम. सर, गुलबर्ग के कुछ प्रोजेक्ट्स के बारे में सवाल पूछना था. ये जो ट्रांसपोर्टेशन की बात कर रहे हैं, ब्लू लाइन मेरे ख्याल से वहाँ से गुजरना है, और इस वक्त कंस्ट्रक्शन भी हो रही है कलमा चौक पे. तो उन्होंने ब्लू लाइन भी अनाउंस किया हुआ है जो गुलबर्ग से गुजर के जॉर्ज टाउन जाएगा. CBD भी अनाउंस हुआ हुआ है. अब ये दोबारा कंस्ट्रक्शंस होंगी, दोबारा से जो अंडरपास और ब्रिज है वो अकोमोडेट करेगा अगर उन्होंने अंडरग्राउंड ट्रांसपोर्टेशन प्रोवाइड करनी है. और दूसरी तरफ से एक्सप्रेस वे भी उन्होंने अनाउंस किया था जो बिल्कुल पैरेलल है. तो ये आपस में समझ नहीं आ रही कि कौन सा प्रोजेक्ट पहले आएगा, कौन सा बाद में आएगा, और कितनी तबाही पैदा होगी. सर,
रैशनैलिटी है इस बिल्कुल, ये ऐसा नहीं है. थोड़े से तुक्के लगते हैं, कभी-कभी चीज़ें गिर जाती हैं, कभी-कभी वो जो ओवरहेड एक्सप्रेसवे बनाने वाले थे, दैट वाज अ कंप्लीट वो ब्रेकडाउन ऑफ प्लानिंग. शुक्र है नहीं बना.
Yeah, I think they're different. जिस तरह Rafay कह रहे हैं, you're mixing different types of projects. The CBD is, I think, a good project in the sense that you took what was almost the ultimate definition of an elite toy, which is to say a private airfield, and now you're going to have high density sort of planned development on that, and because उसकी authority और उसकी funding है, and it's raising money by selling land, and selling very expensive land. I think the sold up to like 42 crores a canal, if not more. So वहाँ से तो वो तो बन जाएगा because it's a construction gig. भाई आप एक दफ़ा किसी को 40 करोड़ रुपए कनाल ज़मीन बेच देंगे तो वो पैसे दे के बैठा तो नहीं रहेगा ना, फिर उसका काम है कि वो बनाए. Then you just have to make sure that you use the money and you build facilities with it. जो बाकी जो चीज़ों की आप बात करें, they're more problematic because they cut across different jurisdictions and different boundaries. So वो एक से to build, let's say even something like I don't know, the equivalent of the orange line, let's say a blue line. So you have to talk about construction, you have to talk about local areas, you have to talk about all of the different parts of Lahore, you have to talk about traffic, utilities, relocation. It's an exponentially more complicated thing. वो अगर हो जाता है तो बड़ी अच्छी बात है. I don't know much more about it, but I'm just saying that there are different types of things. The expressway that they mentioned, that was a bit, वो तो I'm happy that it hasn't been built so far.
Thank you very much. Thank you.